which is focused on culturally and linguistically responsive and asset-based teaching. And then we also have advocacy and policy, which gives students the conceptual tools and knowledge to transform both the policies and structures of education in order to support vibrant anti-racist classroom practices. So if that sounds like something you might want to do, our priority scholarship application deadline for our summer 2021 cohort is December 15th. And if you want more information about our program, you can visit our website or follow us on Twitter or Facebook. And I believe Anne is going to put that information in the chat for folks. We're really thrilled to be able to put on this panel tonight. As we're doing this as part of the Center for Social Justice's Education for Liberation Week. And I'll let my co-planner and colleague, Susie Deer, introduce herself and tell you a little bit more about CSJ.
Thanks, Kristen. And thank you all so much for joining us this evening. On behalf of the Center for Social Justice Research, Teaching, and Service, welcome. My name is Susie Deer, and I'm the Assistant Director for Youth Justice Programs and the Program Director for the After School Kids program at the CSJ, which is a tutoring and mentoring program. As part of our program, Georgetown students tutor court-involved youth and build mentoring relationships to support them as they achieve their academic and personal goals. So clearly today's topic is one that is near and dear to our hearts as a program and as a center and as a university. And our event today is part of CSJ's annual Education for Liberation Week. So I'd love to invite you to attend tomorrow and Friday's events, which can be found on our website, csj.georgetown.edu/Education Week. I should also mention that I'm a proud alum of Georgetown's Masters in Educational Transformation program. I am honored to be joined by our accomplished panelists who will be discussing the critically important topic of policing in our schools. I look forward to what I know will be an engaging and informative conversation. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce today's moderator, Marc Schindler, who I had the pleasure of working with when I worked at the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform a few years ago. Marc Schindler is the Executive Director of the Justice Policy Institute, a national nonprofit research and policy organization dedicated to reducing the use of incarceration in the juvenile and criminal justice systems. Previously, Marc led Venture Philanthropy Partners' Social Innovation Fund Youth Connect initiative, held numerous positions within the DC Department of Youth and Rehabilitation Services, or DYRS, where he worked to transform that agency into a nationally recognized and innovative department that focused on reducing the use of incarceration in favor of community-based solutions, with its reforms grounded in the principles of positive youth development. And he served as a staff attorney with the Youth Law Center, so known as YLC. Marc also served as co-chair of the National Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Coalition and has served on numerous boards and commissions, including as a member of the ABA's Juvenile Justice Committee, the DC Police Complaints Board, the Maryland Governor's Task Force on Juvenile Justice, the Tau Youth Justice Advisory Board, and the DC Mayor's Safer, Stronger Advisory Committee. He started his legal career as a public defender, representing children in Baltimore's juvenile court. Marc is a recognized expert in the field, providing commentary in the national media, including in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and on CNN and NPR, and is also the author of numerous articles and book chapters. Marc is a graduate of Yale University and the University of Maryland School of Law, and he lives in Washington, DC with his wife and 2 children. Thanks for joining us, Marc.
Thanks for having me.
Our first panelist that I'll introduce tonight is Nia Evans, and she is an education justice advocate, a Black feminist organizer, writer, and researcher from Washington, DC. She has spent her career focused on amplifying and actualizing racial, gender, and youth justice. As a campaign manager at the National Women's Law Center, Nia led campaigns to eradicate race and gender discrimination, close the school to prison pipeline, and dismantle the police state in schools. Nia is the leading researcher of Dress Coded, Black Girls, Bodies, and Bias in DC Schools, a report co-written with 21 students, highlighting the racist and sexist impact of school dress codes. She has worked with young people, parents, educators, and grassroots organizations to drive progressive policy and cultural change at the state and local level. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, NPR, and elsewhere, including Elizabeth Warren's 2020 Presidential Education Platform and the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Nia holds a master's degree in education policy and management from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Welcome, Nia.
Our next panelist, Yazid Jackson, was first introduced to restorative practices working in Philadelphia and has been utilizing them to resolve issues in a variety of institutions for over 14 years. While the majority of his career has been in urban education, he's worked in residential settings, private, alternative, and public schools in suburban and urban communities. Yazid has worked with DCPS for 4 years, and he's excited to now support restorative practices in the full network of public and charter schools in the district with SchoolTalk. He stands behind the unique approach that SchoolTalk takes, assessing student needs and designing restorative programs in schools. Throughout his career, Yazid's commitment to support students, schools, and communities has been at the forefront. Thank you so much for joining us today, Yazid.
And last but certainly not least, we have Eduardo Ferrer, who is a visiting professor at the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic and the policy director of the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Initiative, where he advocates to improve the DC juvenile legal system. Eduardo is a certified trainer in the National Juvenile Defender Center's Juvenile Training Immersion Program and conducts training for juvenile legal system stakeholders across the country. Additionally, Eduardo serves as the chair of the board of directors of the DC 127 and served previously as the chair of the board of trustees of the Next Step Charter School and as the chair of the board of directors of the Campaign for Youth Justice. Eduardo also served as the advisory neighborhood commissioner for single member district 1B10 from 2009 to 2010. In 2013, Eduardo was awarded the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project's Defender of Innocence Award for his work securing the release of David Boyce, an innocent man wrongfully convicted in Virginia. He was also recognized in 2008 by Legal Biz Now magazine as a top 30 under 30 attorney in the District of Columbia. Prior to joining the Georgetown University Law Center, Eduardo was a founding member of DC Lawyers for Youth, a DC-based action think tank dedicated to making DC's juvenile legal system the smallest and best in the country. Eduardo is a proud double Hoya, receiving his BS in Business Administration from the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown in 2002 and his law degree from the Georgetown Law Center in 2005. Welcome, Eduardo.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I hope you all audience members are excited about this panel as I am. I will say that it is probably best viewed if you put your Zoom in speaker mode, because we will have our speakers spotlighted. So that will be your sort of your best viewing experience. And I just want to get into a couple of logistics before I let our panel take over. We'll take about an hour for a panel discussion and then open it up to questions from the audience. And at that time, we'd welcome you to chat your questions directly to Ann Musica, our program coordinator, and she will share them with Marc, our moderator. And if you have any technical difficulties, please message Ann as well. And I wanted just to note that this event is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. And then finally, we welcome you to tweet about our panel tonight using the hashtag EDTR speaker series and share widely. And so with that, I will stop talking and hand it over to Marc.
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks, Susie, and thanks also to the Georgetown Masters of Education and Transformation program. It's great to be with all of you, and I'm particularly feel really privileged and honored with this amazing panel of folks. So I'm looking forward to a terrific conversation. I'm big fans of all of our panelists and their work and their organization, so I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Before we jump into the discussion, I've been asked just to share a little bit on the history and the context around schools or police in our schools. And so, of course, we're having this conversation also in the context of a larger conversation, incredibly important conversation in our country around the role of law enforcement. And you know, this comes on the heels of recent tragic killings of George Floyd, of Breonna Taylor, of Rayshard Brooks, and others, and people really speaking out in amazing ways, raising these issues across the country and across the world, pointing to the horrific history of race in our country that obviously goes back hundreds of years, and how this is playing out in communities across the country, specifically Black and Brown communities when it comes to law enforcement. And so it's an incredibly important conversation that's happening. And of course, we've already seen, I think, some signs of hope. We've seen changes in police leadership in some cities across the country. We've seen, I think, a paradigm shift in the discussion, where calls to defund and redirect resources in police departments are happening, and changes are occurring, not as much or as fast as many of us would like or needs to be, but I think there's some progress that we're seeing. And this conversation about the role of law enforcement in our country has moved beyond municipal police departments into a conversation, and I think a very important conversation, which tonight will be part of, about the role of police, law enforcement in our schools with our young people. And this is an issue that is not a new issue. The presence of law enforcement in schools has been a controversial issue for decades, and I think you'll hear that from some of our speakers. So this is not something that people are just raising now in a conversation about defunding police, but is something that has been talked about, worked on for decades, really, and advocates around the country who have been pushing on this issue. The issue of schools, or of police in schools, goes back even further. And so this is not a new issue as well. And like just about everything in our criminal justice system, is intricately tied to issues of race in this country. And so when we talk about school police officers, law enforcement in our schools, we have to go back all the way to the 1940s, when we saw the second Great Migration, with Blacks moving in significant numbers from the South, heading north and west. And so when we saw increases in population in cities like Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, and Oakland, where African-American communities grew quite substantially. And unfortunately, but not surprisingly, the responses in many of these places was punitive, really a way to maintain the Jim Crow culture and forces by another name. And school police are part of this as well. So the first time that we saw sort of law enforcement entities in schools was in 1948 in Los Angeles, when the school district there established its own sort of quasi-police force, really around police and security in schools. And that we're having this conversation in the district. Some of you may have seen a council hearing, I think, which we'll hear a little bit about maybe during the conversation, that was discussing it in that context about school security. And then just a few years after Los Angeles started their school security force in partnership with the LA Police, in 1953 in Flint, Michigan, we saw the first what is known as school resource officers, essentially law enforcement or school police by another name. So we go back to 1953 in that regard. Fast forward, a lot of folks have heard about the '94 crime bill, which has been rightly very controversial, including in the presidential campaigns and discussion. I think what is not known widely is there was a substantial amount of money in the '94 crime bill for school police. And so that was really a time when we saw a significant increase in funding for school police. The next, I would say, very critical moment in this sort of history is 1999, with the school shooting in Columbine, which was probably the most high-profile school shooting to sort of start this trend. And that's really where the influx of school police took off, where we saw the numbers very drastically start to increase in response to a rare but horrific event, a school shooting. And so we saw after that the federal dollars Cops in Schools program added $750 million to help local school districts and states fund school police officers. And that resulted in about an additional 6,500 SROs in schools around the country, and to the point now where we have about anywhere between 14 and 20,000. So that's a quick sort of summary of the history. there's a couple of pieces that I would recommend for folks to look at. There's actually a recent article that just came out, I think the end of last week, in Mother Jones, that talks about this issue, particularly as it's playing out in Oakland, California, and provides some historical context. I see that's been dropped into the chat. Thank you, Anne, for doing that. The Advancement Project is also a terrific organization. They've published a report called We Came to Learn, and that's in the chat as well. And then finally, the Justice Policy Institute, my organization, recently issued a policy brief on this, and so I'd encourage you to look at that as well. That's a little bit of the history, and what we can see is the school shootings really, notably by young white males, are really the instigator for the explosion of school resource officers across the country. But the reality is that the impact has been felt most harshly by Black and brown students, who we see now with the influx of school police officers are disproportionately suspended and expelled from schools. I think we'll hear more about that. And the last thing I'll say is there is literally no research, at least that I'm aware of, that shows that school resource officers make schools safer. Of course, that is the goal, to have, or at least the stated goal for people who advocate for police in schools, but there's nothing to show that it makes schools safer. And in fact, there is evidence to show just the reverse, that it tends to make students feel less safe in their schools. So an important conversation. We provide a little bit of background. And again, we've got this amazing group of folks here to engage in conversation, and then we will we'll have question and answer. So with that, I'd like to jump in. I've given a little bit of background on the issue. I was hoping our panelists could talk a little bit about yourself and your work, and how you're involved in this issue around police-free schools and the movement in DC and around the country. So maybe I'll go first to you, Eduardo, if you can introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background on how you connect to this issue.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark, and thanks for laying that context and that history. So as Kristen said, she did not misspeak. I run what I like to call an action tank. We do not just do research. We do research, we do policy work, we do advocacy work, we do organizing work, and we directly represent young people in DC Superior Court in delinquency matters. So we see the issues from all sides. And part of this, I'll be honest, came from a frustration of just representing young people and seeing the same issues come up over and over again, and feeling often as a public defender that you were running on a hamster wheel and not really getting anywhere. And so the idea was, how do we create an approach that layers in not just the research, right, that sits on a shelf, but also then I realized that there's a layer of arrogance to this, right? We like the recommendations we put forth in our research, and so we try to go make them happen. But we do so chiefly with the mission or the goal of making DC's juvenile legal system the smallest, the best, and the most just in the country. And for me, the emphasis really is on the smallest, because if a young person's touching our system, we've failed them already. And the broader goal is really, in a sense, a realignment of where we now invest our time, our resources, and our money. And particularly in the district, we invest a lot in reaction. So once harm has happened, how do we do it? And we often respond punitively. Rather than investing directly in young people, their families, and communities to the extent that we should, to make sure trauma doesn't happen in the first place, to heal trauma when it does happen, and then to provide the right interventions to make sure it doesn't escalate. But then also to respond more productively when there is harm that occurs. And so the police-free schools work is not something we lead here in DC. It's something we are very much in a supporting role. There's a fantastic organization called Black Swan Academy that is a youth movement here in DC that's really focused, their main goal is convincing adults, and they are 100% right, that we need to love them, not harm them. And a lot of the policies that we have here in the district have the impact or have the effect of, as Marc mentioned, not only not being effective, right? There's no proof that something like police officers in schools accomplishes the goals that we want, but is actually harming them. And in many ways, the research is showing can be counterproductive to our goal of keeping them safe. And so the police-free work that's going on in DC is led by Black Swan Academy. It's being supported out of Georgetown and also out of a coalition that I had the pleasure of working with Nia on for many years, called the Every Student Every Day Coalition, which came together in DC originally to push back against more punitive truancy measures that were being taken, but evolved into really a coalition that's focused on ending the school to prison pipeline. So shutting that front door from the schools to our legal system. And it's actually sad, but shows, right, when you're organized, how things can come about. We had met in March with the coalition to talk about incorporating more intentionally police-free schools into our work. And the Advancement Project came and gave us a presentation. And then a week later, the world ended and the pandemic hit. And so we were gearing up for our annual retreat that we have over the summer. And instead, as a combination of the pandemic and the uprisings, a unique opportunity presented itself in DC. And because Black Swan was so prepared and had already been mobilizing and organizing, was really to inject the police-free schools idea into the momentum that was happening in DC around change. And they were able to get a huge win over the summer during the budget process, which was to move control of the contract for security for all DC public schools, and not the charters, but the traditional public schools, from MPD, from the police department, back to the school system. So we had a hearing today on what that's going to look like. Folks are really pushing for a true reimagination of what security looks like, really adopting a public health approach rather than a punitive approach. And so that's what we're looking forward to working on now. It is going to be a big outgrowth, I hope, from our school discipline reform work that we've been able to do over the last few years. And so that's where we are today.
Right. That's great, Eduardo. And we'll come back to some of those points that you raised. Maybe that's a good segue to you, Nia. You've done really amazing work. I understand you're, I think, a DC girl at heart, but you're coming to us from New York this evening. So, but if you could share a little bit of your perspective, the work you've done and how you've connected to this issue, that would be great. And then we'll go to Yazid.
Sure. So I was born in DC, so I'm a former DC student. I've benefited directly from DC's education. I'm a researcher, so I've worked hand in hand with DC students to understand how Black students are criminalized in school, how police play a role in that, what should be done about that. I'm an organizer. I'm a student of abolition. I'm a member of the Black Youth Project 100 in DC, which is a Black-led direct action org working to actualize freedom and abolition for Black folk. And all of those experiences, I'm also a writer. I write about these issues. I write about Black girls, about issues of discipline, punishment, policing. And so I'm coming to this conversation with all of those experiences and with a deep vested interest in thinking about how Black women and girls are affected by police and systems of policing in school, but also beyond. And I'd say I am coming to you from Harlem. I'm currently working in New York on many of these issues, but deeply still engaged in New York. And I'm coming to this conversation because I've worked for years alongside Eduardo in DC, and I've seen how we are denying Black students of an equal education because we are so invested in systems of punishment and policing. I specifically think about how Black girls, who are 20 times more likely to be suspended than white girls in DC, that's 20 times, at the highest suspension rate in the country. I think about how Black girls are disproportionately policed, disciplined, harassed in school, and not because they're misbehaving more, but because of how stereotypes, racism, sexism, overly punitive policies come together to push them out of school. So that's what I'm bringing to this conversation. And I think that there is a movement that has always been present in DC that this year has brought new life and energy to. And I think we're really on a precipice of seeing enormous change.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for the work you've been doing. It's really amazing. And thanks for bringing your perspective this evening. Why don't we go to Yazid, if you can tell us a little bit about your work, Yazid, and how you're connected to the issue and what's happening in DC as we speak.
Thanks for the invitation. Happy to be here. SchoolTalk, Restorative DC is a project of SchoolTalk, and what we're able to do with Restorative DC is really bring restorative justice to schools in a couple different ways. Our primary way of really supporting DC schools is through our OSCE funded professional developments. We also have monthly community of practices, and how we kind of tap into the schools we support schools in a whole school approach. And what that means is we do a lot of training, coaching, modeling, planning with schools and school leaders to work on some of these issues that we're speaking of today, dismantling the school to prison pipeline. We also have direct support and programming with students, with self-advocacy, student leadership. We also have another layer of supplemental technical assistance where we work with targeted schools with targeted strategies and approaches to really support with systems, structures. We work through hiring structures, really providing support through a restorative lens and a restorative framework. A lot of my other background has been school turnaround, which I've done a lot of school turnaround in Philadelphia primarily, had an opportunity to work in Oakland, Houston, a little bit in Denver, Broward County, in New York City, and really working with school police, working with systems of oppression and systems of discipline, really working on dismantling the school to prison pipeline, making schools safer by not adding more police to schools, but really humanizing the experience of education and allowing and really teaching educators, administrators, the power in the humanity of the work and not the discipline of the work, really humanizing the experience for students and understanding that students learn from people that care and not from people really with the titles that are an assumption of care in education. And so really bringing that experience in multiple ways through activities, through small group assessments, surveys. So trying to really gather a lot of information and data to really support the work that we're doing across the schools. So right now we're supporting a total of 46 schools in DC and really honing in on that and being I stated before, I work for DCPS. So I have a front row seat in understanding how that experience is and how it affects students and also staff members. And that's something that we haven't really talked about, how this actually impacts staff members, that value system does not lend itself to the policing that happens in schools. So looking forward to this conversation and really looking to learn and grow from this experience as well.
Well, thanks, Yazid. It's really, it's terrific to hear about the work you're doing. And you are clearly on the front lines, working with our young people every day. So appreciate that. I have 2 kids in DC schools, so I really appreciate the work you're doing, but I'm sure incredibly rewarding. I wonder, maybe we can go back to you, Nia. You look at this issue, including here in DC, from a number of different perspectives. As you said, you came up in DC schools, you've been doing advocacy, you've been writing. Can you give our viewers a sense of what does it look like for a student in DC schools as it relates to school resource officers? What would folks expect to see? What schools are they in? How does that play out? And your sense of how that impacts the culture and the way the kids feel being in school. If you could share a little bit from your perspective on that.
Sure. So as folks on the line likely know, DC has one of the largest and most bloated police forces in the country. We have an enormously large police force, and that's reflected in our schools. So police officers, as folks would assume, are overrepresented in Black and low-income neighborhoods. If you're a student of color in DC, you're far more likely to attend a school with a police officer than without. Some really crushing data that came out this summer, for every one police officer in DC, there are 129 DCPS students. There is one counselor for every 408 DCPS students. So DCPS students have more access to police officers than they do school counselors and emotional supports. So that in itself is horrifying, but also police officers, much like we see in our communities, play an outsized role in our schools. I think a lot of people like to think that police officers are there to deal with violence that is outside of schools or violence that is inside of schools, but police officers are often inserting themselves and engaging in nonviolent, routine disciplinary issues. So in my research and work, I know that Black children and Black girls especially are more likely to be stereotyped, they're more likely to be seen as a threat, and they're more likely to get in trouble for subjective offenses, things like having an attitude, profanity, not following the rules, things that are vague and hard to nail down, but can have really severe consequences, right? So when police officers are engaging and adding themselves into routine disciplinary issues that should be dealt with by counselors, that should be dealt with by teachers, they often escalate them because those are the tools that they have. So I said it earlier in this call, Black girls are more than 20 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers, which is horrifying. And we know police officers are adding to those numbers. When they are involving themselves in routine disciplinary numbers, they are driving those numbers up. In 2018 and 2019, I wrote 2 reports focused on dress codes in DC, and I wrote them with 21 Black girls who live and learn in DC schools. That's traditional DC public schools and charter schools. And we wrote and we investigated and we looked into how school dress codes were really enforcing archaic ideas, but also carrying really harsh penalties. Students were regularly missing school because of minor dress code issues. And the horror stories I heard, what I never expected to come up in those conversations, were police officers acting as dress code enforcers. We had students as young as 13 telling us that their police officer would stop them at the school door, would not let them come in, would have undocumented suspensions because they were wearing the wrong color shoes. We had students saying, police officers make me take off my head wrap. They make me walk through metal detectors. They make me lift my shirt. They make me take my sweater off in full view of people. There was actual harassment happening by police officers to enforce something as minor as a dress code. So that was like one of the most horrifying, but also clearly stated recommendations that we included in that research, that under no circumstances should students be missing school because of dress code violations, and under no circumstances should police officers be dress code enforcers. So honestly, simply put, rather than giving young people the supports that they need to thrive, that they have told us that they need, we're investing in a system that over-polices, over-criminalizes, and harasses them.
So that's a lot and powerful. It brings me back to, and I'm sorry we don't have anyone from Black Swan tonight, but I know they've been just such a leader in this conversation. It doesn't sound to me, Nia, but you correct me if I'm wrong, that the goal of love them, not harm them is alive and well in our DC schools as it relates to how law enforcement has a presence. Is that a sort of fair statement, that we still have work to do to get to love them, not harm them?
When students have more access to a police officer than a counselor, we failed them.
Yeah. So as you were sharing, I saw, Yazid, you were nodding along as Nia was giving sort of her sense. And I'm wondering, Yazid, if you can just share a little bit. I almost wonder whether you have individual examples recently, well, I guess not recently because kids aren't in schools, but maybe in the last school year, earlier this year, Nia did a great job sort of laying it out and how our kids are sort of being impacted. Can you share a little bit more? Like, what does it look like? What are you seeing?
Yeah, she laid it out. Nia,
I apologize for asking you to follow that, but I'm
just I'm not. That's tough to follow up on. I was nodding because when she was speaking, and sometimes as as, you know, I serve two roles as being in the school and outside of the school. I'm disconnected somewhat with some of these actions. But when I was thinking about when she was saying the numbers, like students have more access to a police officer than a counselor, and thinking about the schools that we support, you know, we have some schools with one counselor, maybe two counselors, but 5 or 6 police officers,
Yeah.
you know, 3 in school, 3 outside the schools that's rotating on shifts. And that really, you know, it really had me just really thinking about, yeah, that is the truth. That's not an exaggeration of what she's saying. And there's been times, you know, I've had incidents of, you know, one particular incident to kind of shed light on dealing with African-American females. We had 2 African-American females, and they, you know, had friends on both sides, and they were arguing. I mean, it was at the end of the day, it was on a Friday. They were arguing safe passage. We were about to go out on safe passage just to make sure the students were getting on public transportation safe, or getting home safe, or getting to their destination safe. And 2 young ladies got into an argument. I separated them. I pulled one, another staff member pulled another, and we were just trying to figure out how it escalated. I was there, I saw it from the beginning. And then as a result, those students were arrested. They didn't fight. They had words back and forth. They were with trusted adults, and they were pulled from those trusted adults to then be arrested for negative posture, attitude, profanity. And they were arrested on a Friday, and they were not contacted by the arresting police officers in time for them to be picked up by their parent or guardian. And unfortunately, they had to stay overnight for an incident that was a nonviolent, it was a disciplinarian issue that was elevated to an arrest, and that invokes trauma. And you know, hearing the words "take out your shoelaces," hearing the clamps on, you know, the handcuffs, them being carried out, crying and screaming, and as a staff member not being able to do anything, you know, you felt like you failed them to not being able to intervene, and seeing some of these situations happen numerous times. But now as Nia speaks, and it provides some imagery and just kind of recalculates my my thoughts and my experiences, and like I feel triggered a little bit. I do see more African-American females, like in my experience, not just in DC, but around the country, being arrested for poor attitude.
Yeah.
And Nia, I appreciate you laying it out in the work that you're doing, because I don't think oftentimes we look at it as you know, a Black female. We look at it as maybe a Black male. But now that, you know, when you laid out those numbers, and it is a disproportionate number of Black females being arrested because of poor attitude and projection. And so very difficult to follow up her statement, but just being able to provide some more context. Hopefully.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. You know, and as you described that incident, Yazid, it struck me, it made me think of, you know, something that we talk about at JPI and others, that there are incidents that I think, you know, back in the day would be more often dealt with in the principal's office, right? That these days get dealt with in the police precinct, right? I mean, the example that you just gave, you know, my wife's a former DCPS principal. I'm quite confident that she and her colleagues could have handled that situation, right? Like you said, in the, you know, there are caring adults there who actually are trained to work with young people. And what happened in that situation doesn't sound like there was any need at all, right? And you had the involvement of police, and then it just goes down that path, right? So I really appreciate you sort of highlighting that. I wonder, you know, there, as you noted, I'm going to go to you now, Eduardo. there's obviously been a lot of work over the years. You guys were planning to do this work and pushing it forward, and then through various reasons, things going on in the world, these issues I think are actually getting the attention that they deserve, and people are paying attention in different ways. So you mentioned the resolution that was passed and the movement within the council to move the contract from MPD over to DCPS. There was, hearings today, literally, I think going on, probably finishing up as we speak. Can you give us a little sense, Eduardo, of your assessment of the progress, if you believe it is progress, and what are some of the takeaways from the hearing today and moving forward that we can look to? Should we be cautiously hopeful? How does the policy environment look moving forward, and what's been happening most recently?
So my optimism changes depending on the day. Mondays, I'm more optimistic. Tuesdays, a little bit more beaten down. But I want to start I think these moves are a step forward, and step forwards that need to happen. But I think they're the first, or actually a continuation of steps that have been taken, but we're still early on in the process. Because one of the big takeaways from the hearing tonight, and I'll build upon what Nia and Yazid were talking about, is folks are so wedded to the status quo. It is hard for them to envision anything else, right? So at Ballou, for instance, there are 12 contract security guards, and there are 5 social workers. Ballou has 1 contract security guard for about every 70 students, compared to Wilson, which is on the other side of the city, which has 1 for about every 200, right? So we're disproportionately policing our Black and our brown kids. But those are people, right? So they have a particular mindset. They have a particular framework. They don't want to lose their jobs. And a lot of them are good people, right? But they have interests in the system remaining the way it is. Yazid's example, that young woman, or those young women, were taken to the Youth Services Center, which this, Marc, nowadays is half full, which means it costs us over $1,000 a night to keep a kid there. That's we spend somewhere between, I think, 12 and 13 for that high school student over the course of a year on their education in DC. And yet we're willing to spend essentially a month's worth of their education on detaining them a night for what? For something that could have been resolved by caring adults who were already on the scene. And so part of my pessimism, or what I struggle with, is there's a big ship that we need to turn, and folks are very wedded to the status quo, and fear of difference, fear of the bad examples that always get brought out whenever change comes is tough. One of the most telling things about the hearing today, they had experts from all over the country talking about the research on policing. And not one person said, oh, there's good research behind the fact that it shows that police actually make us safer if they're put in schools. Not a single one. Right. And yet when you ask to do alternatives, they're asking for double-blind, random controlled studies that show this works and can be applied exactly to the culture in your jurisdiction before they're willing to change anything. And so there's this disconnect between being willing to give up what we're doing, even though it just doesn't work and it's also harmful, and adopting new things because there are these bigger political forces going on. So the second takeaway from tonight is we really have a lot of work to do to shift the narrative. Right? We talk about it even tonight with this shift from the security contract from MPD to DCPS. Stakeholders wanted to talk about, well, how do we make security better? Or how do they administer this contract better? And I think the question needs to be shifted from not, what's the right number of cops in schools, or what's the right number of security guards in schools, but what do we need to do to make sure that that number is 0? And it's shifting the whole conversation, right? It's this notion of reimagining school safety. Security doesn't equal safety. Safety is a much bigger concept, and that's really what we should be pushing for our students. And then the last big theme is the importance of community engagement. I mean, DCPS, their first move in the wake of taking this over is essentially going to be hiring someone to manage the contract, which means they're assuming they're going to renew the security contract and continue to outsource these security guards in their schools. Safety is about culture. And if you don't have that control at the school level over your culture, you're never going to be able to have the type of culture you want. You're never going to be able to actually promote safety. And so community engagement is critical to this. DCPS and the schools, not just them, the charters as well, they need to bring kids to the table. They need to bring young adults. Our young people are right on this. As adults, we need to get out of their way and listen to them and let them lead. And so the community engagement piece has got to be critical. And my hope, DCPS seemed to indicate that they are looking forward to engaging with folks. So I'm optimistic. I did think some of their testimony gave me hope that they hear folks and that they're open. And so I'm hopeful that they follow through with that.
Yeah. Thanks, Eduardo. And so, one of the issues you raise, which I think comes up a lot, right, is this notion of, well, if we don't have police, then what, right? Like, despite the fact that there's zero research or evidence to show that police make a school safer. But at the end of the day, obviously what we want is learning environments that are safe and nurturing for our young people. And so I think it is incumbent upon us to be able to help people understand what would create and help a safe environment. I mean, schools actually are quite safe, right? But we want them to be as safe as possible every day for every student. So I wonder, maybe if I can go, Nia, to you and Yazid, to share a little bit of your thoughts on, Eduardo talked about a culture in a school. Like, share with us and share with the viewers, what should we be doing to make our learning environments safe and nurturing for all students? If not law enforcement, what should we be doing? I'll start with you, Nia.
Sure. So this is why I said early in the call that I'm a student of abolition, because I do think the police-free school movement is an abolitionist vision, right? Yeah. So we are looking not to remove and then period. We are looking to create and build new systems of support, new avenues for resources, right? Like schools need resources to be havens. And so we're also looking, I think Eduardo hit it on the nail with community engagement. We're looking to shift the way young people can influence and change their environment. Like, this is a demand that is coming from young people in school and is being amplified by the community, by advocates, by folks, by educators, by folks who are sitting alongside of them. So I think, to me, the police-free school vision really looks like building over time, because it's not going to happen overnight, but it looks like building new structures of support. It looks like having nurses, counselors, psychologists, social workers who could respond to respond to a whole array of things. For example, the fight that Yazid brought up, that we like to think that, it's something, it should go into the principal's office. That should go into a counselor's office, right? Like that is a conflict resolution issue. And we don't want to go back. We want to go forward, and we want that to be something that young people have space and resources to be able to process and deal with. So it looks like having the social and emotional supports that are so lacking in the district. It looks like resources, right? Like safety looks like having a place where you can talk about things that you're dealing with, but it also looks like having regular, like, food security, housing security, economic security. It's important that we look at this as something that we need to build resources and security and support, and by security I mean stability, up around schools. One of my, I'm so thrilled to be part of this conversation because I'm also a student of education, and I see education as so important because it's a window into the world, right? If you want to study any issue, any problem in the world, you can look at education, because families and kids, they bring their whole lives to schools. And so this vision is something that really looks at the school and the community as one kind of holistic part that requires resources and supports to thrive. And those supports don't look like police officers. I purposely do not use the word school resource officers because that is strategic messaging, right? That is trying to tell us that police officers are the resources that we need, but they're not. They're not the resources that schools need. And so to me, the police-free school vision is an abolitionist vision. It is focused on building and creating new sources of support, of care, of wellness, of stability, so that children, families, and communities can create and have safety that doesn't rely on a system that really uses the tools that it has, which is to incarcerate, punish, and arrest.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And a point well taken about those girls. You'd rather have them go to a counselor than the principal's office. I'm probably a little biased because my wife was a principal, and I think she's probably more of a counselor than a punitive orientation. But you're absolutely right. But you're absolutely right. You know, the principal's office historically is about discipline, right? Yeah. And so I really appreciate that that point. And maybe that's a good segue, Yazid, if you can share your perspective, like how do we, you know, do the best job we can to create safe learning environments for our kids. I'm assuming one way would be to have, you know, you and your colleagues in as many schools as possible. But just share your vision from your perspective. How can we have a safe and nurturing and productive environment for kids moving forward?
Yeah, Eduardo and Nia really touched on it. And we talk about safety. We have to talk about the layers of safety. So physical safety, intellectual safety, being safe and understanding the skin that I'm in. And that's a part of, you know, safety. Being, you know, Black or brown student going into an urban, you know, school is a level of safety. Am I going to be identified as the person I am, or am I going to be projected as a subject that people may want me to be or perceive me to be? And that's another level of safety. Nia really kind of passed the baton on resources. So are we actually prioritizing the resources that are in schools? So we have some schools in DC and DCPS in particular, they may have 5 social workers. They may have 5 counselors, 4 counselors. They may have, you know, 7 deans of students. But ultimately, we're not prioritizing the muscle and the skill of social emotional learning. We're putting that to the side when it's convenient. So when there's conflict, oh, we said we're going to prioritize, you know, social emotional learning, but we really haven't. We haven't given, and I say this a lot in our PDs, we're not giving students an opportunity to fail in our presence. So we're not, we're giving them and naming a skill and saying, hey, go have mastery in that skill because I told you, but the school having a greenhouse effect, which is allowing every specimen, every creature within that greenhouse to learn, develop, and grow. And having school resource officers are actually impeding because the systems of discipline are indicative of the punitive in a criminal justice system. And that's where restorative justice really kind of interjects that whole process. And so really putting more emphasis on the system, the infrastructure, and then building the supports through that so that our students and staff are supported through these measures, and that will take time, but our schools have to prioritize this. And I understand that academics are a high priority, but right now our students are not getting access to the academics because of all of these barriers. So we can't skip this step and say, oh, because you're in a school with qualified teachers, you should be able to learn. And that's a hope, that's a dream, but we're discounting all of the barriers that come with it, like some of the things that Nia stated. When I walk into the door and go through a scanner, like I'm going through an airport and being wound down by security and police, that already impacts my level of education, knowing that I see these same people in my neighborhoods and I see what happens, you know, on social media, and I see what happened, in my neighborhood, and then I'm supposed to have trust when the system has already failed me. So that's a tough pill to swallow as a student, but really honing on really building those supports out and making sure the infrastructure is strong enough to continue to support as we move forward.
Yeah, that's great. That's so. Eduardo, I think Nia and Yazid just sort of laid out, I think what we should be, building towards, right? What we really should have it now. We can share a little bit, and I'll invite the others to jump in too, in terms of the movement, right? In terms of the advocacy, in terms of trying to get to what was just described, like what needs to happen? What are the next steps? There are, as you said, there's been some progress. We can be cautiously optimistic. Today's Wednesday, so that's I guess an optimistic day for you. I don't know what day it is these days. I'm in the same place every day, and so it just blurs. But share a little bit in terms of the movement, like what needs to happen and where are we going on this in terms of getting to that vision?
It's a big question,
Yeah.
especially because I think Nia and Yazid did such a great job of painting what needs to happen, right? And really for me, kind of the lens that I approach it from is what I hear in all that is it's a public health approach, right? It's realigning our resources from the deep end to the shallow end, because the best things that we can do is actually invest directly in our young people and our schools and their communities from the get-go, right? When a kid comes to school scared, when a kid, let me say this. Today I heard DCPS say something like, we haven't been in the business of safety, or we haven't been in the business of security until now. And that is troubling, because we know from the research on trauma, right? Dr. Perry talks about this all the time. If a kid comes to school scared, if a kid comes to school traumatized, they're spending their bandwidth trying to feel safe rather than learning, right? So if schools don't realize how critical safety is, but not in a security sense, right? Not in a policing sense, but this notion of making a kid feel welcome and safe, and like the teachers have their back and the administrators have their back, and this is a place where they can come and be safe, we're not going to get where we want to go on the education outcomes. And so it has to be this holistic approach. It's got to be focusing on prevention. It's got to be focusing on intervention. And, a lot of people say this, our budgets are moral documents. The good here is actually investing in the individuals and the young people and the families, rather than in these systems that have been systems of oppression and continue to be systems of oppression. We need to, as Nia said, it is abolition territory. The fact that we've been trying to reform systems since their beginning, in part because most of these systems are built on very racist foundations, right? It is time to undo that and start anew. And that looks like a public health approach. It's a tall order for the movement, right? It's a tall order for the movement.
So I'm going to give a heads up to our viewers. We'll go to questions from the audience. I think as was said at the beginning, you can, if you haven't already, you can put those in the chat and we'll start to field your questions. But before we do so, just Nia or Yazid, anything that you want to add or build on of what Eduardo just shared in terms of, where the movement needs to go, or, in some ways, like if folks want to get involved and want to be part of this movement, what should they be doing? What can they be thinking about? Maybe I'll throw that to you, Nia.
Sure. So just to put a cap on my point earlier in Eduardo and what everyone has said, I think it's also important for us to keep our eyes on, when we say police-free schools, we mean free of bodies that police and free of the concept of policing, right? So schools can also not have police officers and be policing students through policies, discipline policies, and rules that are extremely harsh and punitive. So wanted to add a cap on that, but there is an incredible movement in DC that has always existed, and that is changing the conversation, because I think, as Eduardo said, it is both a policy and a cultural and a narrative change that we need to go for. I mentioned at the top of my intro that I'm a member of BYP 100, Black Youth Project 100. They're leading important work. Black Swan Academy, as Eduardo said, is at the front line, and they're incredible. The DC Girls Coalition is also doing such incredible work. Stop Police Terror. There are tons of groups in DC that have been organizing against policing and have been focusing on investing and building the systems of support that we actually need to thrive. But I would say, for folks who are looking to take action, I think there's 3 things I want to see everyone do, which is, first, I'd say committing to learning and treating it as a journey. I think that the work of the uprisings that we saw over the summer, the subsequent conversations, there's a lot of discomfort that is coming up for folks around what should happen, you know, what folks are experiencing. Is this too radical? Is this not radical enough? And I think that we all should be committing to learning and to listening to folks who are most impacted by the problems that we're seeing. There's important space that needs to be made. People need to cede space, hand over microphones, invest resources into young people who are leading this work. And I also just encourage everyone to find a political home. And I don't mean political as in Democrats, Republicans. I mean, find political education that can sustain you. There are teach-ins and workshops and town halls, and there is deep organizing and education work. There's building that's happening right now in DC. And it's important to anchor yourself to it so that you have a place to turn to when you have no hope. I have no hope in any of the institutions of DC to do the right thing. I think changes always come from the bottom. It's just a question of whether or not we can create the platforms, invest our resources, and give folks the support that they need to advocate for themselves.
Yeah. I'm going to stay with you just for a moment, Nia, because you started to answer, I think, one of the questions that have been posed.
Oh, did I? Sorry, I got excited.
No, it's perfect. It's perfect. So I'm going to ask you to go a little bit further and share sort of your journey. So the question is, can Nia speak more on her abolitionist perspective and your journey to the place you're currently at? So you talked about some of the organizations that have been involved. I don't know which ones you've been specifically involved in, but share a little bit, sort of take us back to, you know, some years ago and how we got to Nia Evans today being such
Sure, I'll try to make it concise.
All right.
I can say I was in college when Black Lives Matter kicked off. So I became radicalized and politicized through that experience, and of going to a university where police were occupying our dorms, where we didn't have adequate resources. So there's an amazing piece in the New Yorker about the Trayvon generation, but I really feel like I and many other folks in my position have grown up with seeing the excesses of police violence and degradation around us, seeing how it is connected to the plunder of our communities. And through organizing work in DC, honestly, BYP 100, Black Youth Project, finding a home, I say that because having a political home is what I think gave me the language and the ability to describe what I wanted to see in the world. So the Black Youth Project 100 anchored me to that. I've been organizing in DC for 4 years or so. I came to abolition through Angela Davis, and can't remember the title of her book, but folks on the call should know it, and it's a seminal piece. And this summer, like everyone else, I think I've been struggling. I've been testifying in DC council hearings. I've been connecting with organizers on the ground. I've been getting text messages from students that I've been working with. I've got messages from principals who I've worked with to reform their discipline policies about how they want to do things. And I think I'm seeing up close that, you know, we need to, as I said, I have no hope in institutions. I have a lot of hope in people and in building the power and capacity of people to understand these issues. And I think, you know, right now I'm a director of policy and advocacy at a New York organization that is serving Black communities and Black families and children. And that is deeply uncomfortable with abolitionist visions. And so I'm also dealing with the tensions of, I think, a lot of the education and social service organizations that we think would be standing alongside with us are not sure what an abolitionist vision would look like, even if we're advocating for more resources to be poured into education, into social services. The policing state has been so tied up in education and social services that, as Eduardo said, many people can't imagine them separate anymore.
Yeah,
like police are in our hospitals, they're in our schools, they're in counselors' offices, they're in our foster care system. We have tied these things so closely together. So
yeah.
I am also on a journey like everyone else. I'm reading every day. Shout out to Colin Kaepernick recently released a whole set of abolitionist writings that if you want to continue on your abolitionist journey, you should definitely look into, because Black women, as always, are like leading the conversation and doing it in amazing ways.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's my journey. And people like Eduardo and programs like the one at Georgetown, like the one that you all are leading right now, I think are like the people who can turn the ship, as Eduardo said. So I'm really glad to be in conversation.
Yeah. That's great. And thank you for sharing. I mean, I think it's really important for people to hear, you know, people's individual journeys, right? Because I think it really does inform. You know, one of the things you said, and I think I'll take one of the questions that have come up and go to you, Yazid. Nia, you were talking about sort of this over policing, you know, dynamic that we're dealing with. And I was also thinking, like you, very, you know, not optimistic about institutions being able to change things, but also recognizing that people work in institutions, right? And so, you know, how do we, you know, impact folks who work within those institutions and within those systems? And so one of the questions that's come up, and remember, we're, you know, a lot of our audience are educators or aspiring educators. So one of the questions is this: what advice or recommendations do you have for teachers who are working in over-policed schools? How can teachers navigate police in schools, and what role can they play in this movement? And I'm going to throw that to you, Yazid, because you guys are in schools. You're obviously interacting with teachers who are in environments that are over-policed. So what advice do you have for the teachers who are working within those institutions, those buildings, and how to better navigate and what role they can play to be positive?
That's a great question. We kind of started this dialogue over the summer around who are the disciplinarians, and being able to name roles in schools. And oftentimes, you're speaking with teachers, they don't see themselves as a part of the discipline team. And so not the discipline team, AKA the punishment team or the consequence team. But as we look at the word discipline and rooted out of the word disciple, is to teach. And so every interaction should be a learning experience for a student. And so what I would say to a teacher that's in an over-policed school is, get involved in your discipline policy. Really look at what is the discipline policy, what is my role in the discipline policy, and for folks that worked in the school, like, we don't have singular roles anymore. Like, you're the custodian, you're the nurse, you know, you're security one day, you might be a cafeteria worker, you know, all in the same, and then you happen to teach. And I think making sure that our roles in schools are blended and challenging and having authentic dialogue with our school leaders, our administration, our deans of students, to really look at the roles of teachers in this policy and make sure teachers are part of the decision-making. And so when we leave those things to people outside of the classroom, we're actually pushing them out to the system that we don't care for. And so we look at, you know, in DCPS, 73% of incidents happen inside the classroom, but about 12% of incidents involve teachers in terms of their involvement in the decision-making. And so we need more caring teachers to be involved in the decision-making process and not pushing it out to a third party that is not that caring adult. Because what we see happens is there's a lack of trust. And Eduardo pointed out, like, how are we going to establish the culture in our building? And policing has to be a part of that, not necessarily police officers. And so going back to SROs, school resource officers that Nia brought up, like, we have to continue to provide the resources. And how do we, getting in terms of the models and the infrastructures, how do we look at our tier 1 and tier 2 models that keep students in and not push them out? And so how do we, provide more training? What's additional training that teachers need to know outside of their delivery of curriculum, so that we can keep students in the classroom, in the building, and so they're not subjected to outside unconscious discipline that happens sometimes with school leaders, police officers, deans of students, etc. And so students spend more time with their teachers than they probably do with their parents. And so to then push them out for consequences, we need to hold them in and bring those resources within the classroom to provide more supports and interventions. And also having an understanding of the plan to support students when conflict arises.
Yep, that's great. I mean, I think you're going to be called back to speak to the ed folks some more to give them guidance on this. I'm going to go to you, Eduardo, with this next question that was placed in the chat. There's a lot of, the understatement of the day that so many of our conversations these days are so polarized, right? That we're not seeing modeling of constructive debate, right? One of the questions sort of goes to that, and the question is, how do you recommend we constructively and in an informative way handle conversations with people who think police officers do make schools safe, or do not want to recognize that police in schools hurt students more than they help them? So I think, I'm just guessing, probably a fair amount of our audience tonight are, sort of maybe with us, but obviously there are folks who, feel strongly the other way. And how do we have that conversation constructively with folks?
If I knew the answer to that question, I'd be getting a lot better with my family right now. Look, I think it's hard. When I say that people are wedded to the status quo, I don't mean any type of malintent behind that. I think it's in part human nature. I think it's in part of folks' recognition of their role in the system and what change might mean for them. I'm the son of immigrants, and the fear of communism and socialism is something that is very palpable to them and drives their viewpoint on a lot of things. Now, does it necessarily mean that fear is as pronounced as it should be? From my perspective, no. But fear drives a lot of decision making. And so I'll say what I've been trying to do is better understand where the person is coming from, so I can better understand their motives and get at the core of that, and in ways try not to impart any type of malintent to what they're doing. I think as a Cuban American, I've often thought of my life as a bridge between two cultures, and I think in many ways that's what we might be called to do, even if we don't want to, even if it's particularly for Black and brown folk unfair to put the burden yet again on them to be a bridge. But I think the reality of it is we do have to recognize that there's fear at the heart of change, and figure out a way to address it. It's not going to be easy. I like to think that research is helpful. I'd like to think that engagement overall is helpful. Can we sit down and agree on goals and then work through a process for how to get there? I do think to a certain extent, sometimes it is just force. I'm also brought in this organizing world where I believe that power concedes nothing without demand, right? And so sometimes there needs to be a good nudge in order to get folks to realize that their fear was unwarranted, right? In DC, we completely revamped our school discipline code. People were freaking out. and then nothing bad happened. It's like, oh, okay, this is great. In DC, we also significantly revamped our pretrial detention of kids. We went from 100 kids in pretrial detention to 15, and crime continued to go down. And so it's this recognition that I think fear is a big block to change. And so figuring out through both understanding and sometimes force how to push.
Yeah. Thoughts to build on that, Nia? How do we have these conversations most constructively? You're doing it in New York. You've been engaged in DC. What's your thought on when somebody comes at it, who and times is coming from a good place, right? They just want a safe place for their kids.
Yeah,
right?
I'm trying. It depends on the day. So the organizer in me always likes to start with questions, to understand why people feel the way they do, to hear more about their experience. But also something that I think I'm coming to is that we all can play different roles in the movement. That I think there's a lot of expectation put on Black and Brown people to be the educators, to be the mediators, to be the moderators. Something that frustrated me in grad school was anytime I would put forward a proposal that was transformative or radical, I was told you're going to have to compromise. And I think we teach young Black and Brown kids all the time that their life is going to be a series of compromising. So it does depend on the day, but I'm also coming to a realization that the role that I want to play in this movement sometimes might include moderation and mediation. And the role I am now, that's what it is. But the work that I'm called to do is to build power among my people, is to create opportunities for education and conversation and realization for folks to be able to learn new things and take action on issues that matter to them. And so it's also okay to not want to lean into to not do the education work. And so there are multiple roles, I think, in the movement, in the work. Sometimes you're going to have to play those multiple roles. But I think Eduardo is also right when he says that, some things, even a polite conversation, you're not gonna get it. Like, racism likes to do its own thing. And sometimes, like, you're not gonna be able to conversate your way to a non-racist position. Sometimes you will, and it's important that work continues. But I am the first person who will go to the protest and sit in and make demands, because I think any radical change that you have seen has been led by people who were willing to both have conversations, but also make the bold ask.
The bold, let's let that sink in just for a moment.
I just think we should all say, I say it at my job all the time, the world is literally on fire. If we can't say what we need right now, when the hell can we? So big believer in that. Just say what you need and name it.
I see some clapping going on. Thumbs up. Yazid, you're nodding. Do you want to add to that in terms of how do we have those conversations productively, and how do we get folks to a place where what you described and what Nia described and Eduardo of what we really need to have in schools, that is the response, to understand that.
Yeah, and I think with organizations and agencies, we need to start having those conversations within our agencies. And I know for us, we begin to have those conversations, and they're really uncomfortable for a lot of people. But it needs to happen within the agencies that say they're pushing for these things. We have to be, not just on paper believers of the work, but the core value of us personally and professionally has to move this work so that we're able to have this dialogue in a professional realm and also socially, and not for like Nia said, not forge to be the expert and the mediator because we are people of color and not carrying that burden, but also in terms of accountability, it's all of our responsibility to make this thing right. And so how do we kind of forge this, but then how can we have the real conversations within our agencies to make sure that we're sending the message with intensity, with integrity, and with change in mind. And a lot of times we're tiptoeing around these subjects so we don't rub the people in power the wrong way.
Yeah.
Because of our next contract, because it's budget season, and because of all of these things, and not really understanding who's being impacted by us not saying anything. And how do we keep this conversation going, not just in the season of tragedy and loss, but how can, because this happened before then. So how can we, really promote this conversation, and then also educating our young people about the state that they're in, and how do we get their voice and elevate their voice and empower them to actually be able to speak in rooms where they may not be qualified, but they're the experts of their experience. And really having these, like I said, like really having these conversations within our agencies before we really push this work out, and making sure that we have authentic dialogue first within us.
Yeah. Well, I want to, I knew this was going to happen. We're like right at time. We could go on. This has been a great conversation and dialogue. And to your point, Yazid, like we need to continue this, but really push. And like Nia said, be bold, right? Absolutely. We didn't get, there was no way we were going to get to all the questions that were put in the chat. But I do want to be sensitive to folks' time and the hour. And also, I think a lot of us are spending lots of time on Zoom calls. So this has actually been, for me, really remarkable because, sometimes they say, don't go more than an hour on Zoom. Like this just flew. And we've been on for an hour and a half. So I really want to thank our panelists who are, just been so incredible in terms of the information you've brought forth. If it's okay, I think the organizers will probably follow up with you and send you some of the questions that were posed. I think we got through some, good chunk, but there's still more. But really want to thank you for the participating, but more important for the work you guys are doing every day, which is really, for me, just makes me hopeful. So whatever day it is, I'm hopeful today and this evening with you guys, and really applaud you and thank you for doing all you're doing for our kids, for our families, and the community. So with that, thank you so much. I think I'll likely turn it back over, I think, to Kristen and Susie and the organizers, and thank all the folks who signed on this evening to participate. So with that, thank you. And I think turning it back to you, Kristen, is that right? Still on mute.
Hi, yes,
There we
thank
go.
you. I just want to reiterate what Marc said. Thank you all so much. I am like hiding out in my basement and like very, very pumped up and energized by this panel. Yeah, just thank you so much for your wisdom, your work, sharing your experiences, your passion. And thank you, Marc, to you as well for your excellent moderating of this conversation. I think it was wonderful. Thank you so much. Susie, any last comments?
Yes, thank you all so much. I think it's conversations like these that we need to keep having, and then we need to act. I think the action piece is really important to follow it up with learning more, but then doing more. So I really appreciate you all taking the time to join us. I hope you'll join us for more Education for Liberation Week events, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
You too.